Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team. It's honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development Community Workshop offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I am Kimberly from ICF, and I will be hosting today's session. Today's training session is part of our new and non-traditional providers workshop series where we will discuss documenting cost. It is my pleasure to hand over the presentation to our first presenter, Gordon.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon from where I'm at. Good morning to you in California. My name is Gordon Levine. My pronouns are he, him. I am white and Jewish, and I am excited to be delivering what feels like my 100th new and non-traditional session on documenting costs alongside my co-presenter, Mike. Mike, would you care to introduce yourself, please?
Yep, thanks, Gordon. So I am Mike Thomas. I use he, him pronouns, also a TA provider at ICF with Gordon, and happy to be here with you today.
Wonderful. Let's go ahead and get underway. So today's session is on PowerPoint. Today's session is on documenting costs. This is our agenda for the hour. It does say hour 1, hour 2. We are booked for an hour and a half in theory. In practice, we're going to use however much time we need. And our assumption is that we're going to use less time than the full amount allotted, as while documenting cost is an incredibly important part of the work that we're doing. By the size of our audience and by the density of the topic, we are aware that this is not the most riveting hour and a half that you're going to spend in your week. We're going to do a good job making it interesting and engaging. We hope you'll go along with it. We hope you'll learn a lot, but we don't think that we're going to be here for the full hour and a half or 2 hours. So please do just understand that we've got really 4 different elements of what we're doing here today. We're going to talk about financial management practices. We're going to give you some examples of documenting costs. We're going to do a lightning round via Slido, which is one of those external, we put out a question, you give us a response, things like Mentimeter, and then we'll leave plenty of time for you to ask whatever questions you have about documenting costs. As always, while ESG does cascade down from HUD through its direct recipient HCD and down to the subrecipient and sub-subrecipient levels, this training is focused primarily on subrecipient projects. It's most applicable to HCD's direct subrecipients and organizations that receive ESG from them, sometimes called sub-subs or sub-subrecipients or sub-grantees or any of the many potpourri of words that we use for that. And as always, some key vocabulary: ESG is the Emergency Solutions Grant Program. ESGCV is ESG funded through the CARES Act. A COC is a continuum of care. A fiscal year, or FY, is the year in which ESG funds are allocated by HUD. CAHCD, or just HCD, is the California Department of Housing and Community Development, which is incidentally the largest ESG recipient in California. HUD is the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, which funds ESG. A recipient is an entity that receives ESG directly from HUD, like HCD. A subrecipient is a local government entity or nonprofit that gets ESG directly from a direct recipient. These are also sometimes called grantees. Finally, an UGLUG, which is my favorite acronym in the world, is a unit of general local government. We're talking about, for example, your local Department of Housing, for example. It's just another way of talking about divisions of government that aren't just the city of X or the county of X. Turning it over to Mike to give us an overview of financial management.
Yep, thank you, Gordon. So yeah, we'll do a quick overview of financial management because that is the concept under which documenting costs lives. But documenting costs is only one part of what should be a sound financial management system within your organization. Although I will say documenting costs is a very critical part of that. Next slide, please. So the definition: financial management is the process of using funds effectively, efficiently, and transparently. And then in that process, both HCD and ESG grantees are responsible for maintaining adequate control and accountability over all funds, property, and other assets to ensure that those funds are used solely for their authorized purposes. And then on the federal side, the primary guidance where you see how this should be done is 2 CFR 200, also known as the Uniform Guidance. And that guidance has three parts. There are the administrative requirements, and that covers requirements for budgeting. It covers accounting systems and records and internal controls. The second part is cost principles. That's where you find things that are allowable and unallowable, and it's also where you find how indirect costs should be handled. And then finally, there's audit requirements. And right in this context, we're really talking about the single audit requirement, which is the requirement for organizations that receive over a certain threshold of federal funding to have a single program audit performed. And then when these slides go out, you will have active links to all three of those sections on this slide. Next slide, please. So financial data collection. Grantees and subrecipients must, and there will be a link there on the slide when you get these to the specific section that contains this, but must maintain records that are complete, accurate, and demonstrate that costs are allowable, allocable, necessary, and reasonable to the funding source. If you take nothing else away about documentation, this is the thing that I always repeat. Costs have to be allowable, allocable, and reasonable. I kind of roll the necessary in with the reasonable when I cite those three things a lot of times, but it's also an important part. So that is the main thing when you're thinking about documenting costs. You have to be maintaining documentation showing that those costs are allowable, allocable, necessary, and reasonable to, in this context, the ESG or ESG-CV project. In general, financial backup will usually include documentation of the cost itself. So that's where you're showing that you incurred a cost. It's things like the receipt, the invoice, the payroll report, some document showing that you incurred a cost. And then you need proof of payment, something showing that you paid that cost. So this is typically something like a copy of a check or a bank account statement, or sometimes a credit card purchase. Then, if you're talking about personnel costs, you also have to document with timesheets. So you have to show, that's where we're talking about, is it allocable? The timesheet shows how you are allocating the percentage of a person's salary that you're charging to the grant based on the time that they spent. And then finally, you should have a general ledger that reflects all revenue and expenditures by project, activity, and funding source. So that's when we were looking on the previous slide about accounting requirements, that is something that you have to have as a part of your accounting system. So your general ledger must show how costs are being allocated to each project. Next slide, please. And back to you, Gordon.
So let's talk about what financial backup documentation looks like. Hopefully it does not look like this giant stack of papers. We sincerely hope that this is not your financial accounting system, but we do understand that this is an appropriate clip art, all things considered. Let's talk about non-personnel costs, rent, noting that we are going to be swapping back and forth quickly between me and Mike in here. So please just do your best to absorb what we've got coming at you. So for rent for a facility being used to implement an eligible ESG CV activity, such as an emergency shelter, HMIS office, or program administrative office. Backup for that might include, or does include, a lease or rental agreement, rental bills, invoices, receipts, or purchase orders, proof of payment, and a general ledger that supports the activity in question. Please note, and this is an important note, if only a portion of the facility is being used for an eligible ESG CV activity, the rental costs being charged to the program must be proportionate to the percentage of the facility's total square footage that is being used exclusively for ESG CV purposes. If only part of the facility is charged to ESG CV, there must be a written memo describing how the portion of the rent is being billed, the rent being billed to ESG CV was calculated. I cannot emphasize enough the value of that memo. Notes to file are your absolute best friend when a portion of a cost, such as rent for a facility, is being charged to the grant, but not the whole cost itself. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you. Next, we'll talk about equipment. So equipment is an asset acquired with your ESG funds that has a useful life of at least 1 year and a per unit cost of $5,000 or more, and it's to be used exclusively to implement ESG eligible activities. I do want to note here that is possible for an organization to establish a capitalization level that is less than 5,000, in which case that would be your equipment threshold. Please don't do that. 5,000 is the federal requirement, and you cause a lot more documentation pain for yourself if you have a lower threshold. So I would suggest sticking with the federal level there. So when you have equipment, documentation that you need is going to include verification of compliance with procurement requirements. You will need invoices, receipts, or purchase orders. You will need contracts or service agreements, if applicable. You need proof of payment. You need your general ledger, which verifies expenditures by activity and funding source, and equipment inventory records. It's important to note here that equipment must be capitalized, meaning that it is depreciated over time, and your accounting records should reflect that. It must be inventoried. It must be monitored. Records must identify a description of the equipment. You must have some type of identifier, so like a serial number or some type of numerical ID, acquisition date and cost, location, use, condition, and disposition information, such as the date of disposal and the sale price. And disposition, of course, also has to comply with all of the applicable federal requirements for disposition of federally purchased equipment. That is why I say, please don't establish a lower capitalization level, because if you have a lower level, you then have to do all of this stuff for things that might not cost 5,000. So that is my professional guidance there. Next slide, and back to you, Gordon.
All right, thank you. So let's talk about insurance. So insurance costs for a facility being used to implement an eligible ESG CV activity, such as an emergency shelter, an HMIS office, or program admin office. Backup you might be looking for here is an insurance policy, invoices, receipts or purchase orders, proof of payment, and general ledger documentation or allocations verifying expenditures by activity and funding source. Again, if only a portion of the facility is being used for an eligible activity, you need a memo somewhere that describes how the portion of the insurance is being billed to the ESG-CV program. The costs being charged to the program have to be proportionate to the percentage of the facility's total square footage that is being used exclusively for ESG-CV purposes. There are different ways of doing this allocation. Your written memo or written note to file should explain your thinking behind why you're doing it and should be consistent over time. Valuable to have that with the expenditures, valuable to have that in your project file. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you. Utilities. So here we're talking about utility costs for things like electricity, gas, water, sewage, and trash. And we are talking here about those for a facility that's being used to implement an eligible ESG activity, such as an emergency shelter, an HMIS office, or perhaps an administration office. For utilities, you need a copy of the utility bill. There's a chance that it could also be an invoice or a receipt or a purchase order. Generally, it's going to be a utility bill. You need proof of payment showing that you paid that utility bill. And then you need your general ledger verifying that the expenditures are allocated properly to the activity and funding source. Note here that if only a portion of the facility is being used for an eligible ESG activity, then you must have a written memo describing how the portion of utilities being billed to ESG was calculated. And the utility cost being charged to ESG must be proportionate to the percentage of the facility's total square footage that is being used exclusively for ESG. So much like if you're charging rent to your ESG grant, it's the same thing with utilities. If only a portion of the facility is being used for ESG, then the amount of the utilities being charged to the grant should be at that same proportion. Next slide, please.
All right. So furnishings. And we're talking here really, really broadly: cots, room dividers, desks, furnishings. Acquired with ESG-CV funds that must be, or rather, must be used exclusively for the operation of an eligible ESG-CV activity. Backup documentation you're going to be looking for: a verification of compliance with procurement, invoices, receipts, or purchase orders, proof of payment, and a general ledger that backs it up. So I want to linger momentarily on used exclusively for the operation of an ESG, of an eligible ESG CV activity. There is a strong tendency sometimes with funding sources like ESG to look at it and say, ooh, excellent, we can use this to fund our desks, or we can use this to fund our XYZ. Yes, you can, as long as it's being used for an eligible ESG CV activity. What you can't do is go out and buy a desk for your executive director, who is not actually charging any time to ESG CV, or really even a portion of the desk if your executive director is dipping their toe in once a year, for example. Do note that the value of the asset is ultimately going to determine whether it's treated as an equipment or a supply. The $5,000 is the threshold at which the unit, so 5,000 per desk, 5,000 per room divider, it must be considered equipment and therefore have equipment inventory records. Anything less than that is considered supplies. This one can get a little fuzzy, but at the end of the day, having strong written documentation of what you did, why you did it, and the way in which you allocated your costs and thought about them is ultimately your best protection to establish that you are in good shape. Back over to you, Mike.
Okay, so next we'll talk about supplies. That's an asset acquired with ESG funds with the value of less than $5,000 per unit that will be used exclusively to implement an ESG eligible activity. So for supplies, you need verification of compliance with procurement requirements, if applicable there, invoices, receipts, or purchase orders, proof of payment, and general ledger records. So you'll see we're kind of establishing a pattern here for most things. We're putting that you're going to need invoices, receipts, or purchase orders, proof of payment, and general ledger records. Note that purchase materials and supplies must be charged at their actual price. That is net of applicable credits. So if you bought something and then received a rebate, for instance, then it must be charged at the price minus the rebate. You can't charge the full amount there because you got the rebate. So it has to be the actual price that you ended up paying with all credits accounted for. Back to you, Gordon.
All right. Yeah, I think Mike is exactly right. We are establishing really a rhythm of the things that we're looking for, which is at the heart of it. You need demonstration that the cost was incurred, demonstration that money went out the door and was received by the right person, something on your general ledger that indicates the money was allocated to the right place. And then if there are procurement or other standards, you need supporting documentation around the procurement, etc. So for transportation costs, so we're talking about fuel and mileage for vehicles incurred by staff to directly provide eligible essential services to ESG CV program participants. Obviously, outreach is going to be one of those, but it's not the only one. The two categories of backup documentation that are transportation specific are logged miles signed by both the employee and the supervisor. And generally, we're looking for something that says, I went to this place for this purpose and it took this many miles. Bonus points for staplings. Back in the day, we would do a MapQuest printout. MapQuest obviously has gone the way of the dinosaur, but a Google Maps printout stapled to the back of that can't hurt. And timesheets accounting for all hours worked during the week. Timesheets are a necessary accompaniment for this. Do note that these costs have to be charged on an actual cost basis, on a per diem or mileage basis in lieu of actual costs incurred, or a combination of the two as long as the method is used for the entire trip. The message here is you have a number of different ways to think about mileage, but you have to use the same thing consistently over time. For timesheets, you have to identify the number of hours worked directly on each project and activity by funding source. And the timesheets do need to be signed by the employee and the immediate supervisor. It sounds like a lot. It's not really much more than a timesheet would be. The key takeaway here is that you need to be really specific about mileage. So what did you do? When did you do it? And everything has to be signed by the person who did it and their supervisor to establish custody of activity and approvals. Back over to you, Mike.
All right, phone and internet. So we're talking here about phone costs and internet costs, including for phones, things like the device, monthly bill, and insurance, and then for internet, things like equipment and monthly bill, and that they are incurred for the purpose of carrying out an ESG activity. So here we are looking again for verification of compliance with any applicable procurement requirements. We're looking for the invoices, receipts, or purchase orders, the phone or internet service plan or agreement, proof of payment, and general ledger records, as always. And note here that if the phones and or internet are used for both ESG and non-ESG activities, then the costs charged to the program must be equitably distributed and proportionate to the amount of time that the phone is used for eligible versus ineligible activities. So that is another instance where it would be a good idea to have a memo on file determining how you have broken that time out and how you are charging a proportionate amount of those bills to your ESG grant. Back to you, Gordon.
All right, let's talk about food, because it's lunchtime and many of you are hungry, I bet. Food and supplies, which includes the storage of food, boxed meals, water, and snacks to feed eligible ESG program participants, people who are enrolled in your project. Mike's over there taking a drink of water. Sorry to call you up. This is just perfect. Eligible costs are for program participants, not for thirsty staff or TA providers. The backup documentation requirements here are exactly the same as for everything else. Procurement requirements, some demonstration that you bought the thing, some demonstration that you paid for the thing, and a general ledger that verifies the expenditures down to the activity and funding source level. Note that this does not include food for personnel providing eligible essential services to program participants. Unfortunately, you cannot pay for snacks for your staff, though would that it were. Back over to you, Mike.
All right, so security. We're talking about security costs, and that is generally compensation for an individual engaged in security services. It could also be a contractor engaged in security services. We're talking cameras, security systems, locks, and light fixtures for security purposes that are incurred to ensure the safety of the ESG facility, personnel, and program participants. So here you need verification that you've met any procurement requirements, I'm assuming is what that is. Rental bills, invoices, receipts, or purchase orders, proof of payment, and general ledger records. So we're going back to those same three things: your invoices, receipts, records that you incurred the cost, your proof of payment, and your general ledger. Again, note that if only a portion of the facility is being used for eligible ESG activities, then the rental costs being charged to the program have to be proportionate to the percentage of the facility's total square footage that is being used exclusively for ESG purposes. Also, if only part of the facility is being charged to ESG, there must be a written memo describing how the portion of the rent being billed to ESG was calculated, and that proportion should be consistent with what you're charging for security and for other things that we've talked about throughout this presentation. You'll notice there's kind of a pattern there too. If you're only using part of your facility for ESG, then you have to document how you determine the proportion being charged to the grant, and that should be applied to any costs associated with the facility itself. And back to you, Gordon. Oh, you're muted.
Wow, just said a lot of stuff. Sorry about that. We seem to be on security costs again. Sorry about that. That's a duplicate slide. Only to note here that the costs of security, much like the costs of renting a building or everything else that we've been talking about, if a portion of it is charged to the grant and a portion of it is not, you need to talk about how you came up with the allocation, and you need to ensure that your records support that only a portion of the cost went to the grant. Back over to you, Mike.
All right, maintenance. Maintenance costs are things like installation, appliances, supplies, and compensation for individuals performing repairs or upkeep of buildings and equipment. And it's to ensure that the facility is in safe and operational condition. So when you think about maintenance costs, again, You want verification of compliance with any applicable procurement requirements. You want invoices, receipts, or purchase orders. If you have them for the type of maintenance you've procured, then you're looking for contracts or service agreements. You need proof of payment, and you need your general ledger records. Note that replacement of appliances or portions of a structure must include documentation of how the appliance was unsafe, unusable, and or more expensive to continue using than to replace. Costs incurred for improvements which add to the permanent value of the buildings and equipment or appreciably prolong their intended life must be treated as a capital expenditure. So that's something I want to note that's very important. That has come up in my past life managing grants. There is a difference between what you can charge to maintenance versus something that is a capital expenditure. A real life example I dealt with, if you were, we had to replace the floor in a bathroom. We were ultimately given guidance that it was going to increase the value of the house that our organization owned. Replacing that floor was a capital expenditure. It was not maintenance because it was a major project. So if you have questions about that, reach out to either your grant administrator or your rep at HCD and they can help you figure it out. But just be aware when you get into bigger projects, you can start skirting that line between maintenance and capital expenditure. Just be careful of that. Back to you, Gordon.
Thank you, I appreciate it. And just on the subject of capital expenditures, very briefly, you do generally want to stay away from them if you can possibly help it, because they are an order of magnitude more complex than maintenance. And so you talk to your GA absolutely and establish if possible that the thing is not a capital expenditure. However, as you know, sometimes capital expenditures are necessary. And so knowing what you're getting into is the most important thing so that you're documenting it in the correct way from the beginning, rather than scrambling on the back end to say, oh, those cabinets are a capital expenditure. It's not rehab. It's not maintenance. It's rehab. So just something to keep an eye on and just go in with your eyes open. It's 2 eye metaphors in a row. Let's talk about participant supporting costs. You've noticed that the color of the slides have changed slightly. We've gone to a pleasant teal, indicating we've segued to the participant portion of our presentation. Hotel motel vouchers. And I want to distinguish here that we're talking about actual hotel motel vouchers. In other words, emergency shelter equivalent vouchers, not rapid rehousing or homelessness prevention that is being used to lease a unit in a building that was at one point or is still generally operated as a hotel or motel, but is for all intents and purposes housing, not emergency shelter. We're talking about an emergency shelter equivalent situation in which a unit is rented by the night or by the week or similar. This includes the costs for hotel motel rooms, cleaning the rooms, and repairing the damages caused by participants. I would say potential damages, repair potential damages. As with non-participant costs, are 4 pillars of expenditure backup documentation are the same here. You need to verify compliance with reasonability. So reasonability in 2 CFR 200 is always there. You need some demonstration that a cost was incurred, an invoice, a receipt, or a purchase order. You need proof of payment, some demonstration that money went out the door, and your general ledger needs to back up that the expenditure was ultimately billed to the right place, down to the funding, the activity, and the funding source levels. Note that vouchers are eligible expenses only when no appropriate emergency shelter is available. Can't just go out and say, well, we've got this empty emergency shelter, but it would be nicer if we rented hotel rooms. You have to demonstrate that there's no emergency shelter available. I recognize that in most communities, this is a fairly easy thing to do, but demonstrating this before you rent the hotel motel room is a solid practice. That demonstration can come in any number of different ways. A note to file is always good. Backup documentation might come anywhere from out of your anywhere between like your local coalition, a letter from your local shelter, your HMIS. There's lots of different ways to back it up in ways that aren't just your program manager saying, hey, I called 2 places and they said no room at the inn. So things to think about for that. Over to you, Mike.
All right, vaccine incentives. Note that this is specifically for ESG CV. Incentives for vaccines can be up to $50 per dose, including boosters for a maximum of $150 in monetary compensation. And this is specifically for eligible ESG program participants to receive the COVID-19 vaccine. When you have those costs, documentation would include a certification that the program participant has not received other financial assistance for the same dose that's being charged to the ESG program. So you just have to have some sort of note, some sort of certification that they did not receive the same assistance from some other place. Official COVID-19 record card that verifies that they received the vaccine and when each dose was administered. So that little nice little gray card that they give you when you get your COVID-19 vaccines, a copy of that. Your general ledger verifying expenditures by activity and funding source. So again, we need to see those costs reflected in your general ledger, and proof that the payment was made to program participant after they received the dose. So in other words, the form with program participant information, vaccine data, payment information, and signed by the program participant and staff member. So again, we're talking about proof that it was made to the program participant after they received the dose of the vaccine. So the date is going to be the key thing there on that. Back to you, Gordon.
Thank you. And I'm going to uplift what I said in the chat because it seems like it might be good just to have this on voice. Vaccine incentives are great because COVID-19 is still a real and serious challenge. I know that some folks have moved away from seeing it as a persistent challenge, but it does still represent a leading cause of death and a leading cause of hospitalization in the United States, as it does around the world. And it is especially a challenge for people who are at heightened risk of morbidity and mortality and people who are living in congregate situations, which disproportionately means people who are experiencing literal homelessness, either in sheltered or unsheltered situations. And so if you have a homeless population that has not been thoroughly canvassed for vaccines, this is a great way to use your ESGCV dollars to improve your population's resilience against this ongoing challenge. So I'm going to say about that, but please do take this seriously. This is a great resource and you should take advantage of it while it's available. Moving on, renters insurance. Renters insurance costs for eligible participants receiving ESGCV homelessness prevention or rapid rehousing assistance. Backup documentation here is the standard stuff. The general backup for expense being incurred would be a rental assistance bill that shows the participant is responsible for the account, and that may be billed either monthly or quarterly or annually, depending on how the insurance is set up. You're also going to need a lease or rental assistance agreement that indicates that rental insurance is required to reside in the unit. You will also need certification that the participant is not receiving other financial assistance to cover the cost of rental assistance that's being charged to the ESGCV program. In other words, you need to make sure that there's not a duplication of benefits. This is true for most of the things we're talking about for participant support costs, but this is a common one that folks just overlook because it's renter's insurance. It's not a lot of money. It's not, you don't think of it in the same way as you think of like, ooh, duplication of benefits for case management or duplication of benefits for rental assistance. It's a small one, but you do need to keep an eye on it. Back over to you, Mike.
Rent. So rent is a big one. How do you document rent? We're talking about the rental costs, which will be monthly rent or arrears. For eligible ESG program participants receiving assistance under homelessness prevention or rapid rehousing. So you're looking here for rental bills, invoices, receipts, or purchase orders that show that the participant is responsible for the account. I'm going to skip down to the one below it there, the lease rental agreement that verifies rent amount and compliance with rent reasonableness requirements. I skipped to that one because I want to note that not all landlords are going to give a rental bill every month or an invoice every month. It could be that the lease is what you have that meets that standard. So if the lease clearly shows the amount being charged and all that, that's typically going to be sufficient for showing that the participant is responsible and what amount they're responsible for monthly. So you've got that. Then you need your proof of payment. When you make those payments, you've got to have that proof. So usually that's a check or some type of transaction record. Then you've got your general ledger. As with everything else, you need to show that it was allocated to the right program. And then finally, you need to think about duplication of benefits with this one as well. So you have to have certification that the participant is not receiving the same rental assistance from another source. Back to you.
All right, furnishings. So remember how earlier I said we were talking about furnishings not for participants? Well, now we're talking about it for participants. We're talking about furnishings acquired for use by eligible program participants receiving ESGCV homelessness prevention or rapid rehousing assistance. Note that this does not include street outreach or emergency shelter. You cannot buy, for example, furnishings for people who are living in an unsheltered location. It's a little complicated as there's a little tiny bit of wiggle room around what's considered an emergency intervention. But generally speaking, please do not buy, for example, a recliner for someone or a couch for someone who's living in an unsheltered situation. Let's get them rapid rehousing instead. Backup for this is what you would expect. Some indication that there was a cost incurred, that money went out the door, that it was charged to the right place on your general ledger, verification of procurement requirements, and because furnishings are equipment, we'll get into that in a minute. We're talking about procurement, and finally, an equipment inventory record. Do note that participant furnishings and furniture are equipment and must be capitalized, inventoried, and monitored, meaning you need to keep an eye on where they are. And if somebody asks where the heck that couch went, you need to have an answer. Records have to identify the description of the item, its serial number or identification number, its acquisition data and cost, location, use, and condition, which sounds like a lot, but really what we're talking about is sofa this color and length, ID number X, which we stamped on the bottom, which we bought on this date for this amount, and it's currently in HMIS ID participant number XYZ, or 123, I suppose. HMIS ID number laws, apartment, use is a couch, right? Or bed frame used for bed. Upon the termination of ESGCV assistance, participants must return all furnishings and furniture that were acquired with ESGCV funds. I'm going to say that again because this trips people the heck out. You can buy furnishings for participants, but once the assistance ends, the participant has to return all of the furnishings and furniture that were acquired using ESGCV funds to the organization that bought them. This is complex. There is detailed guidance linked there, and I encourage you to review it if this is something that you are involved in. If you were sitting there and thinking like, are you telling me that we're supposed to like reclaim a bed from somebody and pass it on? The answer is yes. That is what that is the way that the program works. Does it make a lot of sense to me personally? No. Not really. It does not make a terrible lot of sense to me personally, but it is the way that the rule is written, and it is the way that you need to operate. And so there's a couple of ways to think about that. One of them is thinking about using ESGCV to purchase the kinds of things that you could reasonably go to a participant and say, all right, year's up, cough it up, we need it for somebody else, and save other funding sources, such as private dollars, to purchase things. And remember, you can't use them as match because match is still program funds, though you have no match requirement under ESGCV. So you're really talking about annual ESG there. But using non-program funds to buy things like mattresses that you would not in a million years want to go back to a participant and say, all right, year's up, give us the mattress back. So thinking about furnishings that you might want to get back, or that might reasonably be able to get back, or that you can assist, you can tell a person, you know, this is yours for the year, and then, you know, we're going to take it back and sanitize it and pass it along. Such as, for example, and this is, I think, the best example of this, a computer desk. So if you're setting a participant up, for example, who is in a position where they need to do 100% work from home, or they're in a position where they're doing schooling as their primary mechanism of this is how I'm getting toward the income I need to self-sustain. Equipping them with the furnishings they need to do schooling remotely with a computer and a chair and a desk and all the rest of it. Those are all furnishings, equipment that you can supply participants with. And they're reasonable things that you can ask for back at the end of the year without any of the wibbliness around like, we need your mattress back now. So thinking about things that make sense as a take back versus things that make sense maybe for your private funds. Just a word out there to the wise. Over to you, Mike.
Sorry, I was muted. Sorry, we were getting a package and my dog thought our house was under attack, so I muted myself for a couple of minutes there and forgot to unmute. I am talking about security and utility deposits. A little less complex than the furnishings that we just talked through, but important nonetheless. So these are the deposit costs for eligible program participants with homelessness prevention or rapid rehousing assistance. So for security and utility deposits, you need a copy of the lease or rental agreement that verifies the deposit amount and compliance with cost reasonableness requirements. You need the deposit bill, invoice, receipt, or purchase order that shows that the participant is responsible for that account. Then, as with everything else, you need your proof of payment and your general ledger records. And just like with rental assistance and most of the other things we've talked about here, you have to have documentation that there is no duplication of benefits. Back to you, Gordon.
All right, thank you. Moving costs, which includes truck rental and moving company on behalf of eligible participants receiving ESGCV, HP, or rapid assistance. Backup documentation is the same as everything. The three things we always talk about, plus verification of compliance with cost reasonableness. So we do not want you running gold-plated vans. Just a regular van will do. Do note, and this note at the bottom is the one that everybody is going to care about on the slide, I think. Temporary storage fees for up to 3 months are eligible, so long as the fees are accrued after the date the participant begins receiving ESG assistance, but before the participant moves into permanent housing. Note also that storage fees in arrears are not eligible, in addition to which ongoing storage fees are not eligible. And so ongoing storage fees, and this is always a point of contention, the situation we're trying to avoid here is a participant has been living in an unsheltered location or in an encampment for a long time, and they have a lot of stuff, but they don't want to keep a lot of stuff in their new apartment. So they need somewhere else to put their stuff. And so the program, hearing that this is important to the participant, says, all right, well, what about a storage, like not a storage locker, but what about a storage unit? The participant says, yeah, that sounds great. Project can't pay for a storage room for 12 months. Can't do that. 3 months as part of the moving process, yes, because it has to meet the reasonability test. Ongoing storage, absolutely not. That again is a place where you might look to flexible funds such as private dollars to cover a need, because realistically, and this is part of the humanistic nature of delivering ESG services, sometimes that's the difference between getting a participant to say yes and not, right? If a participant says, I need this, ESGCV might not be able to support it, but your private dollars sure might. So something to think about. Back over to you, Mike.
All right, transportation. So we're thinking primarily here about things like public transit fare and these costs as they are incurred by program participants to travel to and from eligible ESG essential services. So for these costs, you need a case memo describing the use of single-use passes, including who used the pass, when they used it, where it was used, and that's signed by a program participant and staff member. That documentation should be certified by both. This is very important for things like public transit passes because it is possible to have a public transit. So say that you have a bus pass. If you give it to a participant and they use it to travel to their ESG essential service, you have an eligible cost. If you give that exact same pass to that exact same participant and they use it to travel to, say, a water park, that is not an eligible cost. So it's the same thing. It's been used by the same person. It is the way in which they use it that makes it eligible or ineligible. So you have to document who used it, when they used it, how they used it, and it must be certified. Then you also have to have an invoice, receipt, or purchase order showing that you purchased that pass, proof of payment showing that you paid for it, and your general ledger records. Back to you, Gordon.
Mike, I've got a question about this slide. And I'm
Yeah.
genuinely asking because I know the answer on the COC side, and I'm not sure I know the answer on the ESG side. Can you talk a little bit, or are you able to talk a little bit about how this interacts with bicycles?
Bicycles. Cost to use a bicycle, it is my understanding, can be eligible under transportation. So if a participant has a bicycle, there's a cost associated with using that bicycle to get to and from ESG eligible or ESG essential services, then yes, that is an eligible transportation cost in my understanding.
Oh, that matches my understanding too. Could you use ESGCB to buy a bicycle for a participant for the duration of their stay in the project to get, for example, to and from a job?
Yes, my understanding is that you could.
Oh, that's my understanding too. I'm glad we're on the same page.
Yeah, I've heard nothing to contradict that, so I'm sticking with it.
All right, well, that sounds good to me. And I know that that is true on the COC side as well. For those of you who have COC program grants, that bicycles are treated identically to cars. The mechanism of transportation is irrelevant. Transportation costs apply equally to more and less green options, which includes, by the way, if you are purchasing a bicycle for a person to do eligible activities, Mike, what happens at the end of the grant when you purchase a bicycle for a person and they are no longer in the project? What do you do with the bike?
Sounds like it needs to stay with the program.
Sounds like it to me. And I bet there's somebody downstream who would enjoy that bike. Not
Yeah.
maybe so much the mattress, but probably the bike.
I mean, theoretically, any mode of transportation could be eligible if it's being used properly. I don't know that I would recommend using a hot air balloon to transport people for these purposes, but hey.
I was thinking large catapult myself, but yeah, I don't think any of those would be good ideas. But a bicycle is pretty good, especially if you've got. But like, in all seriousness, like, transportation costs can be a lot of stuff, right? It doesn't just have to be mileage. It's public transit, which includes bus, but also streetcar. If you live in a place with streetcars, which some of you probably do, it includes longer distance bus transit. It can include, for example, taxi fare, if that's what's required. Bicycles, it can include all sorts of things. If you can justify a Segway and it meets reasonableness, reality is sure, fine. So
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's an important note here. You mentioned mileage. It's not on the slide, but if a staff member is transporting someone for essential services, that mileage is also eligible under transportation. The real difference being, instead of we have the case memo thing here on the slide, you'd have a mileage log showing the mileage that they incurred for that purpose. Everything else would be the same.
Yep, you got it. Yeah, see, these presentations, even on the subjects that seem one of the things I like about these presentations, and you'll forgive me getting a little nostalgic, I hope, is that even on subjects that may seem a little dry, like documenting costs, there is always a humanistic angle that we can find on them, because ultimately we're talking about how to deliver high quality services to people who desperately need them. So it's my little spiel on that. I think it's my slide next. I think I stole that slide. All right, we're over to personnel costs, everybody's favorite. So let's talk about security. So this is compensation for staff on the payroll engaged in security services, incurred to ensure the safety of ESGCB facilities, personnel, and participants. So we're looking for three things here. Timesheets. Okay, we're going to dwell on timesheets a little bit here. Timesheets that account for all hours worked during the week, regardless of whether they are for ESGCV or something else. They can be for the Mars mission. You have to account for all of the hours that they worked for your organization during the week. And specifically, they need to identify those hours, break them down, not just by program. So you can't just say 20 hours Mars mission, 20 hours ESG CV. That has to be 20 hours ESG CV broken down into individual project types. So we want to see hours to ESG CV homelessness prevention, hours to ESG CV street outreach. Needs to be down by component. In addition to which, as always, we need proof of payment, money that went out the door, canceled checks, etc., or verification of electronic transfer, and general ledger supporting those expenditures. Do note that timesheets must be signed by the employee and their immediate supervisor. Signatures are complicated. The most common, by a wide margin, the most common thing that I have seen from organizations that are otherwise doing their timesheets well during monitoring are questions about, like, we have an we're a giant organization, right? We're a big community action agency. We have 15,000 grants. ESG is like 0.01% of what we do. We have a timesheet system that involves like these checks and balances and oversights, but like there's not a physical signature because it's all handled electronically. Is that kosher? Ultimately, you're going to want to talk to your GA about that. But generally speaking, in those situations where you're dealing with an organization that has a really like well-developed timesheet accounting thing, first of all, there's going to be a way for employees to sign off and supervisors to sign off. You don't need a physical signature. What you need is a sign off, which is slightly different. A physical signature is often a way that that's accomplished. What you need is controls and approvals. Review it with your GA. But the other thing is, in those big organizations that have lots of funding sources and complex accounting methods for their timesheets, generally, they've already been reviewed and signed off on by like other federal agencies or bigger federal agencies or HUD with a bigger funding source. And generally speaking, if another federal agency is signing off on the thing and saying like, yep, this meets 2 CFR 200, you're probably good to go. So that's a way to navigate a sort of common second order concern. The number one problem that I see is that hours are not actually allocated down to the individual project component. So we'll see like, you know, they spent 20 hours on ESG. Okay, cool. So they did street outreach or rapid. What did they do? You got to make sure that you have it down to the component level. And if you're not currently doing that, because I guarantee somebody out there in the audience is having a freak out because you're not currently doing that, this is the time to start doing that. And if you need guidance on how to make that shift, talk to your grant administrator. Over to you, Mike.
All right, so we're on maintenance. So I talked a little about maintenance before. This time we're talking about maintenance that's performed by personnel on your payroll. So that's the distinction there. And we're talking about personnel doing the same types of things that we talked about earlier. So maintaining the facility or appliances to ensure that it's safe and operational. It is the same three things that Gordon just talked through. You need a timesheet showing that those hours, how the hours are accounted for and how they are allocated to the ESG project. So you need that same kind of timesheet for these personnel. You need the proof of payment and you need your general ledger records. I'm not going to harp on it because we talked through it earlier when we talked about maintenance, but still want to be clear that also in this context, there is a difference between a maintenance expense and a capital expenditure. So if your personnel are doing routine maintenance to keep the facility safe and operational, that's fine. If they are doing something like renovating the kitchen in the emergency shelter, that could potentially be a capital expenditure rather than a maintenance cost. So just be aware of that because as we talked about, capital expenditures come with a lot more in terms of documentation requirements. So just be aware of that. It applies if your own staff is doing it as well. Back to you, Gordon.
I'm muted. All right. Compensation, staff compensation, meaning wages and salary for carrying out eligible activities like providing services, operating facilities, or overseeing and administering ESG-CV programs, by which we mean the costs of salaries and wages for everybody involved, which are your case managers, your program managers, your budget specialists, your grant managers, your HMIS staff, and even that executive director if they're dipping their toe in every so often. Here's what you need. Payroll register or pay stub summary sheets. You need proof that money went out the door. So that's a canceled check or that's electronic deposit record. You need a general ledgers. You need general ledgers verifying expenditures. You need a general ledger. Words are gone. You need general ledger verifying expenditures by activity and funding source. And you need timesheets that account for all hours worked during the week in the way that I described them previously. This is critically important because it is behind rental assistance, the single largest expense for many ESG programs. And getting it right is the difference between having very easy reimbursements that happen smoothly and very challenging reimbursements that are a struggle and nobody really has any fun with. So I would encourage you to get this right. If you're not sure whether you've got it right, check it with your GA. Put a lot of effort into getting it right on the front end, and the back end is smooth sailing. Over to you, Mike. Ooh, fringe, good one.
Yeah, fringe benefits. So these are things like cost of leave, unemployment insurance, pensions, unemployment benefits, things of that nature for staff carrying out your ESG activities. And this can also include staff engaged in oversight of ESG activities and administration. So really anyone that you'd be charging payroll to the ESG program, fringe benefits would go along with that potentially as well. We've divided them into two sort of buckets here. We've got the first one with your employment insurance, pensions, things like that that are specific to your organization. And then we've got on the right there your Social Security and other similar benefits that all organizations pay. For the employment insurance, pensions, things like that, you need your invoices, receipts, or purchase orders, the benefits agreement, employee direct distribution or proportion, proof of payment, and your general ledger records. And then for Social Security and other similar benefits, you need your payroll registers or pay stub summary sheets showing those expenses, proof of payment, and that can take a few different forms, but you just need proof showing that you made that payment, and your general ledger records. You have to demonstrate that the costs do not differ significantly for different groups of staff. If the costs do differ significantly for different groups of staff, then those groups have to be sort of put in their own separate buckets, and you have to show how allocations are made for each of those buckets. The most important takeaway I think you can get from this is you will allocate the fringe benefits the same way that you allocate salary. So however you have divvied up salary based on the timesheet records and how staff interact with the ESG program in terms of their time, that is the same way that you want to allocate your fringe benefits for those staff members. That is the cleanest thing to do. It is generally going to be the most appropriate and reasonable, and it's the easiest. So you can just divide them up the same way that you do salaries. And back to you, Gordon.
All right, healthcare. So these are healthcare costs for staff carrying out eligible activities. Yes, healthcare costs for staff carrying out eligible activities such as the provision of essential services, operation of facilities, or oversight and admin of ESG-CV programs. In other words, that's all of your staff who are involved in ESG-CV. You need invoices, receipts, or purchase orders, proof that money went out the door. Your general ledger needs to reflect it. You need verification of compliance with procurement requirements, and you need an employer-employee agreement, which needs to be signed and otherwise in the form that you would expect. Do note that these costs have to be equitably distributed among projects and activities based on the amount of time the staff member dedicated to ESG-CV versus non-ESG-CV projects and activities. What we do not want to see is if a person spends 1 hour a year on ESG-CV, that you allocate 100% of their healthcare costs to ESG-CV. It needs to be proportionate. And if we were in a live or classroom setting, I would say, okay, how would you do it proportionally? And it depends. There are a couple of different ways of talking about it, but generally speaking, basing it on their average hours a week allocated to ESG-CV is a good place to start. So if on average they work 10 hours a week of their 40 toward ESG-CV, 25% of healthcare costs would be an appropriate way of moving forward. And I would ask, how would you document that that's how you did it? A note to file is the way that you want to handle that. Something in your project policies and procedures, something in your project manual, something in your project file that says this is how we're doing this. And generally speaking, this is something that's handled at the organization level, not the project level. But if it's not already being handled at the organization level, you need something at the project level that says this is how we're thinking about this. Back over to you, Mike, though there is no indication that this is you.
That's okay. It can be me. So this is just pointing out a helpful resource that's available to you for ESG CV. California HCD has created a checklist that identifies acceptable forms of backup documentation by cost type for ESG CV. So reach out to your grant administrator for a copy of that checklist if you don't already have one. It is a helpful resource for you because it does point out the specific types of documentation that would be looked for in monitoring and things like that. So if you have ESG CV, that is a very helpful resource for you. If you have annual ESG, it'll probably help get you to the right place with documentation as well. So if you're interested in that, you can reach out to your annual rep.
All right, well, that brings us to the lightning round. I love this clip art. It's been with us for so long. Lightning round will be handled through a system called Slido. So please do join us at slido.com. Go to slido.com. It's going to have a thing up at the top where you can join by entering the code that you see displayed on your screen. The code in question is 3844564, 3844564. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and then I'm going to share the Slido screen. It will have the same code on it. I'm also going to post a link to the Slido that will take you directly there without the code in the chat so that you can go ahead and get there directly. So hang tight just a moment. It would mug a little bit harder at the screen, but frankly, I'm just trying to click things and copy them. All right, so here is the link to Slido. It is now in the chat. Slido is great. We're excited to see you there. Go ahead and give that a click. Now sharing in Slido on my end. If I can ever find my Zoom screen. There we go. All right, everybody should be able to see Slido. Can I get a thumbs up from somebody? Cool. So go ahead and join. Move on in. Looking for participants. We have 0 participants so far. I see Trisha. I see Amanda. Thank you. Thank you. Miriam, thank you for joining us. Chris Pitcher, thank you. Caitlin, Pamela, Amanda, Irma. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Elizabeth, thank you for joining us. I see others in the chat who are not yet on the quiz. I'm hoping to get 10 folks. I'm at 8, looking for 10, seeing 10, looking at 9. I'm looking at 9. 9's what I got. I'm 9, 9. Araceli, 9, looking for 9, looking for 10. 9's what we got. 10, 10. Loretta writes 10. 10 is where I wanted to end. So let's go ahead and get started. So the way this is going to work, Jay, thank you for 11. We've got, I think, 8 or 9 questions here. I'm going to go ahead and swap them back and forth, starting with me, swapping them over to Mike. You're going to have 45 seconds to answer the quiz when you see the question come up on your screen. Most of them are pick the best answer. Occasionally you will have a tell us what the wrong answer is or pick all of the above. But yeah, that's pretty much what we got. It's a quiz. It's not that complicated, especially after the presentation you just saw. 13. Oh, I'm so impressed with you all. Thank you, Ian. We're going to go ahead and get into it for the first question. Just don't know why words aren't with me today, but they were only not. All right. First question, 45 seconds on the clock. John purchased a computer system for ESG Rapid valued at $5,000. Under what expense activity does this fall? Please pick the best answer. As always, there is a shiny gold star on offer for the person who guesses what the naming theme for the day is. The naming theme for the day being names that we're using for the questions. If anybody gets it based on John and no other information, there is a shiny gold star, and I will send you a $50 check. It may not actually be cashable, but I will send it to you. It might just be a check mark that says 50 on it. Let's have a look at what folks said. Overwhelmingly, folks said this was equipment. Let's have a look at what the answer was. It was, of course, equipment. $5,000 is the threshold at which something becomes definitely equipment, unless you have a policy that says it's lower than $5,000, which, Mike Thomas, is what kind of a policy?
That is a bad policy.
Bad policy is exactly correct. Mr. Mike Thomas, you want to take us over to our next quiz question going in 3, 2, 1, click.
Yep. All right. So Jamie, purchase meals for distribution at an encampment. Which of the following is not required to receive reimbursement for that expense? So one of these things is not required. Which of those is it? You have 32 seconds. What do you not need out of the things listed there on the screen? Always acceptable to say not sure if you're not sure. Meals distributed at an encampment. One of those things does not make good sense there. Almost there.
Lots of answers.
Time's up.
All right, let's have a look. Ooh.
Service agreement, by
Yep.
far the biggest one. That is, of course, correct. You would not have a service agreement for meals that were purchased. So that is not required. I do agree. Procurement records. That was our second highest one there. That's a little tricky in that situation because procurement records implies like the procurement process and things like that. Really, here we're just showing proof that you had a process to go out and buy those meals. We're not talking about like equipment procurement.
All right, Mike, can I ask you to take the next one, please? As there has been a knock at the door and I have to figure out what on earth is going on there.
Yep.
Thank you, sir.
I will do it. So 45 seconds. Beth is submitting payroll for security staff. Which of the following are required to receive reimbursement for this expense? Which of the following are required to get reimbursement for payroll for security staff? You've got 3 things there. Then you've got an all of the above option and a not sure option. What do you think you need? Ten seconds. And time. Let's see. 92% of you said all of the above are needed. And that is, of course, the correct answer for any kind of payroll expense. You need timesheets, you need proof of payment, and you need your general ledger showing the allocations that you made. Very well done.
All right, thanks for covering that, Mike. Next question is up. Case processes payroll for the grant and is submitting payroll expenses for reimbursement. He has submitted the payroll register and copies of employee paychecks. Is this enough to be reimbursable? To receive reimbursement, to qualify for a reimbursement, is it a reimbursement worthy packet? Yes, no, or the ever popular not sure. No takers on the theme for the day. It's a little trickier than usual, other than Trapper John MD, which is the Trapper John MD. First of all, not right. But second of all, Trapper John MD may well be the vinyl record of gold star responses.
Gordon, I think I know the theme, but I'm not allowed to participate, right?
You're absolutely not allowed to participate. Unless your answer is aftermash, in which case you can participate but not get it right. All right. Interesting. Quarter, you said no. Some of you were not totally sure. The answer is no. Those of you who answered no are absolutely correct. That is not enough to be reimbursable. Mike, next question. Let's have a look at what else might be required.
All right. So from the previous question, what was missing from Casey's payroll expense request? You just went through that one where there was something missing. What was the thing that was not there? So if you recall, you had the paychecks and you had the payroll register. There is something that was not there. Which one of these things was it?
This is a select all that apply.
Which of these things were not there? Select all that apply. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Give you a hint. The fourth one is absolutely correct. Anybody who does not collect the fourth one, identify yourself in the chat so we can have a follow-up.
All right. Looks like timesheets and general ledger got a lot of attention there, and those are of course correct. You have to have timesheets showing how a person's time was allocated, and then a general ledger record showing that you allocated that expense appropriately in your accounting system. Well done.
Indeed. Thank you to the 10% of you who decided that a thoughtful note to your grant administrator would be appreciated. That would be Mr. Chris Pitcher, and at least one of you who is deeply hoping that we can see who is answering these questions, then and we'll award you points on the back end. Next question. Rep purchased a new van for ESG Street Outreach. Which of the following paperwork items are required to receive reimbursement for this expense? Check whichever applies. This is not an all that apply. This is check the one that applies. Miriam has got it. Incidentally, this is the one that I got it. Miriam, you get the gold star for the day. It is indeed Yellowstone. A show I have never seen, but my unfortunate exposure to the zeitgeist meant that I knew what was going on. Internet poisons. Can't get away from it. All right. Wow. 100. This is going to be embarrassing if all of y'all are wrong. So have a look. You are, of course, correct. All of those are required for the reimbursement of that expense. If you're thinking, gosh, that's a lot of paperwork for a van for street outreach, it is a lot of paperwork for a van for street outreach. And not having all of it will cause you just the worst headache 12 months after you buy the van. If you're thinking about buying a van, come back to this quiz later. Please review this checklist. Next question, Mike, you're up.
All right, Monica purchased masks and gloves from Amazon for distribution to participants living in encampments. The purchase was made using her company credit card. Is she required to comply with procurement standards? Yes, no, it depends on the amount of money spent, or not sure.
I like that we had to specify Amazon.com as though no one is quite sure what's Amazon? Did they buy this from the rainforest?
They were unfortunately probably made from the rainforest. I'm sorry, that's horrible.
It's terrible, but true. We embrace honesty around here and sorrow.
62% of you said yes, followed with 23% by it depends. What's the answer? Yes, the answer is yes. The purchase would be subject to procurement standards.
Not necessarily equipment procurement standards.
Good point.
Tricky question, sneaky question.
Yes.
It's our only sneaky question for the day, I think, other than the one about the thoughtful note for your grant administrator, which 90% of you got wrong. And our last question for the day, Jimmy drives his own vehicle while taking a client to an appointment. Is this cost reimbursable? Which of these is the correct answer? Only one of them is right. Show us what you got. Incidentally, this was the first question I looked at out of all of them, and I thought, my goodness, we're doing Better Call Saul. Love it. Huge fan. We were not. There is no rip in Better Call Saul.
Unfortunate, but true.
There are plenty of RIPs, but no rips.
Yeah.
An interesting crossover.
Yeah, that would Yellowstone, Better Call Saul Christmas special. I would watch that.
I would definitely watch that.
Yeah. All right. Interesting. This is good stuff. Okay, well, the majority of you thought yes, if a log mileage form is signed by everybody involved, which is the correct answer. This is an interesting one, so I'm going to linger on this because it's our last question of the day and we got a little bit of time. The 15% of you who aren't sure and the 15% of you who think clients can't be transported in personal vehicles. Some of that is true. So let's talk about that a little bit. There is no ESG rule that says participants can't be transported in personal vehicles. That's not a federal rule at all. It might be a good personal boundary to set. And in fact, I would encourage you to set that personal boundary because there's a safety thing there. There's a personal space thing there. There's a personal professional divide there. It might also be an agency rule. And so you're going to want to review your agency policies and procedures around giving participants rides. And those participants can be there for a lot of different reasons. Some of them are liability oriented. Some of them are just to stop you from doing stuff that's like, a participant needs X and I got into this to help people. And so like, sure, I'm going to drive the participant to see their grandma they haven't seen in 3 months. Like that makes good sense, right? But that's not an eligible program expense. Like you've now blurred the professional personal lines in a really significant way. So that's worth looking at. Those of you who answered yes, as long as there's a gas receipt for the trip, yes, you do need some demonstration of purchase. But that's not the only, you need a demonstration that the thing occurred. Gas receipts, not necessarily necessary. It depends on how you do mileage reimbursements. A logged mileage form that is pegged to the federal mileage reimbursement rate is fine. Receipts may be required by your agency policy. I think it's a good policy. It's not necessarily everybody's policy, but it is a good one to demonstrate that money was actually spent on the thing, right? And those of you who are not sure, if you're not sure, it's because this is complicated and there are a lot of different ways to do it and there's no one way that's right or wrong. So yeah, we appreciate your honesty and your engagement of this Q&A with us. So I'm going to go ahead and take this down. We are now into the Q&A portion. You should just be looking at Chris Pitcher's beautiful face and the rest of our mugs. Yeah, this is your time to ask questions. I know we had a few in the chat. Kim, would you be able to uplift those and throw them at me and Mike? And for those of you who have questions but haven't asked them, drop them in the chat, come off mute, let us know what you're thinking. We're here to answer.
You want me to read them out or you want?
Yeah, throw them at us.
Okay. The first question is, could you please give us an example of documentation of compliance with procurement requirements for furnishing?
Good question. Mike, you want to take that?
I am not prepared to talk through an example. I apologize. I'm not a procurement master.
Sure. Well, I'm not a procurement master either, but I'll take a swing at that. So examples of compliance with procurement, you need to, you should have an agency procurement policy. Your agency procurement policy should be consonant with 2 CFR 200, which is the federal, it's sometimes called the Omni Circular, but it's your federal uniform guidance around cost principles. That has procurement language that your agency policy should talk about. So 2 CFR 200 guides your agency policy, which should guide your project implementation policy for ESG and ESG CV. In terms of backup documentation, what you're looking for is some documentation that you followed your agency's policy. And so if your agency's policy says, you know, our procurement policy is we solicit bids and we need to get at least 3 bids from, or 3 is it's for furniture. So you're not, it's not like you're bidding out, you know, rehab work. You know, you need to price this item of furniture from 3 different outlets, and you're going to go with the best price, or you're going to go with the best intersection of price and value as defined by XYZ in the policy. And then having as part of the purchase, you know, a printout from the website from the 3 places that you were going to buy the furnishings. And then a cover that says this is who we went with and this is why we went with them. You know, it's the best price or the best value or something like that. That'd be the kind of thing that you're looking for, is some indication that there is a policy, indication that you follow the policy, backup documentation demonstrating that you follow the policy. That's the way I would approach it. All right, what else we got, Kim?
Thank you. Oh, and they also said they're curious about documenting procurement compliance for supplies.
Well, that's same basic deal. You know, procurement for supplies, because it's so small, procurement standards aren't, there's a difference between procurement standards for things over $5,000 and under $5,000 per unit, right? So your procurement policy at the agency level is very likely to distinguish the difference between supply procurement, which is like buying pens, and equipment procurement, which is like buying a van. And so if you're buying a van, you're going to get bids and price 3 different things and blardy, blardy, blar. If you're buying pens, your policy probably says something like, go buy pens. Or it might say, we have an arrangement with officesupply.com or whatever, and that's where we get pens. So buy them through officesupply.com, in which case the backup documentation might look like a purchase order or a receipt from officesupply.com, or just like a receipt from Staples or something like that. If Staples is still in business, I must admit, I haven't gone to a Staples in a while. But that's the kind of thing you'd be looking for supplies, is you need a policy, and your backup documentation should be consonant with that policy, which probably says either go use your corporate credit card, or go use your own card and get a reimbursement, or create a purchase order from this existing chain that we have. Those are kind of your 3 typical options.
Yeah, and I can add, I think in that context, something that's really important to keep in mind is that really that dollar amount is the important thing when you're thinking about which procurement standards would apply, because, you know, there are some things that feel like equipment that can actually be treated like supplies, like an $800 computer, for instance. You buy the $800 computer, you can go out and buy that, you know, consistent with whatever your internal process is for purchasing supplies. It is a good idea to tag and track that computer the way that you would track inventory for equipment, but ultimately it's not subject to the same disposition standards and all of that. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Just because it feels like equipment doesn't mean it's equipment that has to go through that whole process of getting different bids and stuff like that.
Agree. Good addition. Thank you, Mike. What else we got?
And then the next question is, what happens when the ESG CV program ends? Do you take back all the furniture?
This is this question is I think of these as tumbleweed questions, because they get everywhere. They're impossible to detangle and they're spiky no matter where you grab them. Short answer, yes, with a but. So you do, in theory, when the project ends, you do, in theory, have to do something with the furniture, with all of the equipment, not just furnishings, bikes, whatever else, equipment that has been channeled down to participants that belongs to the project does need to be reclaimed by the project, right? However, reclaimed by the project could mean a lot of different things. There is an equipment, I think it's published at this point, right? The equipment and disposition policy. There is a really clear HCD policy around what you're supposed to do when you have equipment. And the reason it's an equipment acquisition and disposition policy is it clearly addresses what happens when you reach the end of the grant period and you've got equipment that you're supposed to do something with. And you know, in a nutshell, you're supposed to reclaim it, and there's an order of operations you're supposed to follow, and it's roughly like you reclaim it and use it on the project that bought it, or you reclaim it and use it for any other HUD project doing the same thing, or you reclaim it and use it for any other HUD project, regardless of whether it's you or a different organization. And then you recover it for any other federal project doing anything anywhere. And then you like throw it off the face of the planet or something. Like there's a pretty clear order of operations, and you should easily find you should easily find somebody who can take it off your hands or take it on once the original use no longer exists. And that's not just for when the project winds down, it's for when the use case no longer exists, which could happen before the project is canceled, right? Like an example for that might be if you buy a street outreach van and your street outreach project reconfigures such that it no longer needs transportation in that way, like you buy a van and your city passes a massive public infrastructure thing and suddenly you no longer need a van. I'm just dreaming. But like you no longer need a van because suddenly there's a streetcar that goes everywhere. Like, okay, you don't need a van. So now you got to figure out where to put this van. And it might end up 2 counties over with like a cap agency 2 counties over doing ESG or doing something for DHHS. Like it's hard to say, but all of those are coherent activity or uses of the disposition policy. So that's the policy that I would turn to when you have equipment that you need to figure out where it's going. Mike, anything you want to add on that?
I'm actually going to jump in on top of Mike here. Sorry, Mike. So in the past, ESG has not had a lot of equipment we've purchased because ESG CV is so much larger. In some cases, 10 to 14 to 15% larger, 15 times, not percent, times larger. We do have a lot of it. So HUD is very aware of that and knowing that they need to put out better guidance. We in California are pretty good because we have the policy that Gordon referenced, which I did put in the chat. But look for more guidance from HUD as well, because they are keenly aware that this is coming up and folks are going to have lots of questions. Sorry, Mike.
No, you're fine. It might be better I didn't say what I have a very interesting gray area example from my nonprofit days that I don't know that I should share.
No, share.
So the question was, we had furniture. There was a participant who needed furniture. We couldn't give them the furniture. The question was, we go through this whole process. We don't have another program it fits in. We don't have another federal award it fits in. We don't have any of this. We request, disposition instructions from HUD. Field office tells us that it's garbage, dispose of it. What if we put that outside for the garbage truck to pick up? And then what if someone who happened to be an ex-participant happened to come by and find it on the side of the road? I'm not going to answer that right now. I'm just going to state that as a gray area situation that happened when I worked at a nonprofit.
I think that's a great example. And it fell off the truck. I think that's important. And I would really highlight that, if you look at the disposition policy, there is a thing at the end that says all other cases is you have to ask the field office for instructions. And at the very top of that list is if it's under $5,000, you can do whatever the heck you want with it. And the field office, it depends on the field office, who knows? But I got to tell you, if you go to a field office and ask what to do with a $500 couch, the field office is probably going to say, like, please just give it to somebody who needs this couch. This is not worth our time to figure out an elaborate response mechanism. And so that's, at the end of the day, work with your field office to figure out a solution if you can't figure out anywhere else to go. And somebody was on camera earlier and giving me faces when I was talking about like reclaiming mattresses. Like that is often what happens with mattresses is like, that's it kind of cycles back out, and that's okay. The other thing that I would address, since we're on equipment and disposition, is loss. Is at the end of the day, if you have 100 participants and you give out 100 bikes, you're not getting 100 bikes back, right? Like they will not all come back to you. If you got 90 back, you're doing good. And that's a reality. Some of it is that participants are just going to walk off the bikes. And some of it is that your bikes are going to get broken, and some of it is that the bikes might get stolen, right? That's exactly it. Those bikes are going to walk off or ride off, as it were. And so that's why inventorying is important. You don't need to get into disposition if the thing disappears. You just need to account for what happened to it. And it's not like you're not in danger of recapture if you buy a fleet of bikes and one of them disappears for whatever reason. Like, you're not really in danger of recapture. That's just kind of a thing that happens. It's the same thing as, like, sometimes participants will do damage to units that exceed security deposits. That's why you have, like, rental assistance overages to cover damages beyond what is expected. Sometimes stuff happens. So things to keep in mind. Other questions, feel free to pop off in the chat, pop off verbally, pop off at us, pop on, pop under, pop eye. That's asking while eating spinach. All right, Kim, we got another question in there. Cue us up.
Okay, for tracking time. Okay, tracking time on timesheets down to the project level. Our organization only has one ESG-CV component. When everything ESG-CV is ESG-CV rapid rehousing, do we still need to note that on the time card?
Well, let me ask you, Miriam, what do you think? Putting you on the spot?
Let's see, I don't have bandwidth to show myself, but I can speak. Part of why I'm asking this question is because we haven't been, because we have just been calling that ESG CV, because it is the only ESG CV going on here right now. And when you said we needed to be tracking this down to the component level, I wanted to confirm that our current documentation standards are sufficient.
Interesting question. So let me hit you back on this one. Understood. You've only got rapid rehousing. Do you use admin dollars at all?
We don't have, I'm an indirect cost. So all of the time I spend on that grant is within the 10% de minimis indirect cost reimbursement.
Even more complicated. What about HMIS?
No, we don't have specific HMIS tracking associated with that grant. We do, of course, collect HMIS information and add it to the system, but we don't have funding to support that process dedicated from this grant.
That makes sense. Here's what I would say ultimately. The answer is yes with a but. So you do need to track it down to the component level. You always need to track it down to the component level. The indirect cost of it all makes that a little more complicated, I think. Not my area of expertise, and I'm going to tag Mike in a moment if he has something to say about that. And if he doesn't have anything to say about that, we're going to redirect you to the indirect cost presentation for more info. But the but in this one, though, is if you really genuinely only have money in ESG rapid rehousing, no admin, no HMIS, nothing else, you're fine, basically. It's not the way that we would prefer to see it done. It's not a best practice, but you're probably okay because it is your only component. My recommendation to you is go into your general ledger and rename the thing. And keep it like if your accounting department's not going to have an absolute like flip out, rename the thing. Just take care of the naming thing. But if that's like too much to ask, if that's asking the mountain to move, at the end of the day, if you've only got the one, if you've really only got the one component, and you're definitely not going to put any other money into any other component ever, and you're really confident about that, stick a note in your file that says, in our general ledger, number 12345, when it says ESGCV, it means ESGCV rapid rehousing. And when a monitor swings through and says, hey, what's this about? The answer is you give them this letter dated whenever that says, hey, this actually means this. And that's the way you resolve it. Mike?
Thank you.
Oh, you're
Yeah,
very.
I think it's a good answer, Gordon. And I just go on to say that, ESGCV is a one-time funding source. It's going away. But annual ESG could change from time to time. So if you were getting the annual ESG, I wouldn't just set it up as ESG. I'd say ESG rapid rehousing, ESG HP, but not for ESGCV as we're getting close to the end.
Mike, anything you want to add on indirect costs?
I don't really think there's anything to add. If you only have that one component, that's where your indirect costs are going to be charged anyway. So the same thing really applies. If you did have separate components, you'd want to have it separated out so you could show the indirect cost being charged to each component. But since you only have the one, the same thing applies.
Good question. Good question. Other anythings? This is your moment to pop eye. I'm sparing you all my terrible Popeye impression. Just this is my gift to you. Because it's not an eligible compass. All right, well, it looks like we're out of questions. If you have other questions, please do direct them to your grant administrators. They are experts and are happy to help. Kim, you want to take us on out?
Thanks, Gordon, Mike, and Chris. Thank you all for attending this California Housing Community Development Community Workshop session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. Look out for our next new and non-traditional providers workshop series next month. A 3-question survey will pop up as the session ends. Please provide your feedback so we can ensure these training sessions are as useful as possible. Have a good day, everyone.